Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Happy 4th of July to you. I actually want to piggyback on what you just saw in that short little video there in John chapter 8. You're welcome to turn there with me this morning. Of course, we're celebrating the anniversary of the declaration of our independence as a nation. When that declaration was made, we were declaring independence from something and to something. Independence from Britain and freedom from tyrannical rule. But then on the flip side, we were declaring liberty to exercise the inalienable rights that have been given to us by God alone, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. You know, independence is a very tricky concept. You might think that that word is synonymous with freedom. But as you well know, there are many people who are granted freedom. They take that freedom of choice and they freely choose bondage. And oftentimes they misidentify that bondage as liberty. It was actually Huxley and George Orwell, both atheists, by the way, who wrote books. One was, I think, in the 32 or something. The other, I think, 1949, 1984, I believe. Both were cautionary tales that describe a free people unwittingly choosing a form of government which we know today as totalitarianism. Now, totalitarianism, if you're not familiar with it, it is presented as a kinder form of socialism. It's when people are drawn into a collective, a hive mind, if you will, and believe that those they have chosen, the ruling class, that they have chosen them because they know better than we do and have our best interests at heart. Now, totalitarianism is incrementally achieved by presenting a larger vision, and this is what separates it from so many other forms of socialism, is that there's a grand vision. And the invitation given for people to join in to this massive vision, to gather around it. And in our case, there are numerous grand visions. I would mention one that is more of a worldwide one, and that is climate change. And it is presented as something that is so vital, so important, that people are convinced to give up many of their freedoms for the greater good. And how many times have you heard that statement in recent times? The greater good. The World Economic Forum, again, has put out a video years ago that shows the aim and goal of global governments to basically create a system where people own nothing and yet are happy. You've heard that. You will own nothing and you will be happy. And at the heart of that is this idea that the common man cannot be entrusted with the assets of land and resources because mankind will mismanage those resources. So, of course, the government, who is so wonderful at managing resources, decides that that is within their purview to have those resources and then tell their people how those can be used. In fact, they have such control that the number of people using those resources is also within their control, and that's where we get this concept of population control. And again, it is all sold as that which is necessary for the greater good. And so, within totalitarianism, through propaganda, suppression of other forms of opinion, people are brought to this place where they believe that as long as you're of the hive mind, that you're of the collective, then you are a good guy. And any person who is a nonconformist, by nature, is evil. And we saw that with the pandemic in recent years, that those who weren't willing to follow the mandates and do certain things for the greater good were villainized and demonized as being evil people because they had a different opinion. So people within this grander vision, they have certain restrictions, certain restraints, but within totalitarianism, one of the hallmarks of it is that people are given certain freedoms. And they're limited, but they're the freedoms that many people pursue, which are freedoms such as hedonism, pleasure-seeking, The governments of the world are far less concerned about morality than what you might think. And so that's why today what we have morality-wise in our society and our cultures is because as long as people are pleasure-seeking and they're concerned with their own personal desires and happiness, the less likely they are to rise up. They legalize drugs. Again, this is all taken from these books, by the way. You can see these patterns unfold if you read these books, Brave New World, 1984. The legalization of drugs. Permeation of society with mindless entertainment so that the masses are incapable of rational thought. This is the cautionary tale that was told to us 80 plus years ago. Essentially, the ability of governments to take freedoms from the people without them even understanding that they're no longer free. And we haven't seen the end of that system, and it is finally implemented, where you will have the oppression basically against those who are the nonconformists. They will be made examples of. They are the outliers of society, and therefore they have to publicly persecute, or in these books you have torture and other things to make an example so others won't question this collective mindset. Why am I sharing that? Why is this, this message starting off with such a buzzkill? We're talking about celebrating the United States of America. Because I think that it's good, as Frank said, to be proud of the country that we're in, and certainly out of respect for those who've made the ultimate sacrifice, our forefathers, and what they've done to bring us this country, and with all the freedoms that we enjoy. And there's certainly no other nation in this world where I would rather be. I think it's still the greatest nation on this planet. But simply to point out that these men, who were atheists, by the way, they had no fear of God, but they simply saw social and cultural trends. They experienced totalitarianism in different forms in their days. So they understood it. They understood how society moves to that end. And the cautionary tale is coming true. Little by little, you're seeing incrementally the things fulfilled that you read in these fictions. And let's be honest, if the founders were to reappear today and look at this country, that they would be shocked, because it's not the same country that they sought to build. I found something very interesting. I don't know if you saw this yet, but the new 2022 quarter now has Washington facing away from "In God We Trust." And now, whether or not that's was meant to be, what I perceive it as is that him turning his back on that concept of trusting in God. Little things like that incrementally through society, where in reality, our country and many countries of the world are turning their backs on God. Now, I used to get very political. I can make this whole message political, but that's not my point today. I used to love to talk politics in the pulpit and felt my responsibility was to tell people where we are and all the things that are happening in this world. I think it's good that we know some of these things, but over the years, I've realized that the greatest way to help people identify counterfeit liberty is by showing them what real liberty looks like. And that's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to take you to a passage in John 8, a discourse on liberation given to us by none other than Jesus himself. John chapter 8. I think this is important for us to have a concept of freedom, of liberty, what it really is, because we're seeing the counterfeit of that in our society today. In verse 31, so Jesus was saying to those Jews who believed in him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants, have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you seek to kill me, because my word has no place in you. I speak the things which I have seen with my Father, therefore you also do the things which you have heard from your father. And I'll just pause right there for a moment. I'm going to make 3 points today about freedom, liberty. The first being freedom's deception. I want to make some observations. Jesus is talking to some individuals about liberty. And there's a lot of insights we can draw out of this section right here. The first observation we make is the audience that Jesus is addressing in verse 31. Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him. So he's talking to the Jews, Jewish individuals. And he implies to them that if you knew the truth, then you could be set free. Now again, understand who he's talking to. Imagine being in their shoes. You're the people of God. God has entrusted to you, to your people, his law. You are the physical descendants of Abraham. And someone has the audacity to tell you that you're not free, that you don't know the truth. And the reality is that they didn't know the truth, even though they had the law of God, because what is the ultimate purpose of God's law? It tells us in the New Testament that it's our schoolmaster to bring us to Jesus Christ. The whole point of the law is to point us to the holiness of God, the righteousness of God found in the person of Jesus Christ who fulfilled the law. So here you have the embodiment of God's holiness, his righteousness, standing before them, and they didn't recognize him. They didn't see it. He came unto his own received him not, the Bible says earlier here in John. Well, here's what's interesting. When you go back to verse 30, and Jesus is teaching them, he had just gotten done talking about how he's the light of the world, and whoever follows him will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And he's speaking all these things to them, and you notice in verse 30, as he spoke these things, many came to believe in him. And those are the very people that Jesus is addressing here. You notice again in verse 31, he's saying to those Jews who had believed him. So initially it seems like there were many Jews who did receive him. This reminds me of John chapter 2. When he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, he did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. He knew what was in their hearts. In other translations. In other words, these people did believe in him. But what was the nature of their belief? It was ultimately exposed as the section goes on to be nothing genuine, nothing beyond intellectual assent that very quickly changed. They went from believing him to wanting to murder him. They made a mental choice, but not a heart choice. And so Jesus says to them, you're in bondage. And one of the great deceptions today, when it comes to liberty and freedom, is that people, like the Jews, are trusting their inheritance, their heritage. By virtue of growing up in a free nation, we think, well, I'm free. I know all about freedom because I grew up in the United States of America. I grew up in a Christian nation, or largely Christian nation. I grew up in a Christian home. I believe in Jesus. I'm good. And what we find here is that it may not be the case. It very much depends on the nature of your belief. Whether it's just merely a head knowledge or if it's something you know personally and intimately with the heart. And furthermore, we see that the deception of the Jewish people, not only because of their ties to Abraham, they just assumed we're a free people. Did you notice their response to him when he said, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free? And they said, we're Abraham's descendants. We've never yet been enslaved to anyone. Does that strike anyone else as comical? That's like really funny. Because the irony here is that if you look at Israel's history, it's like a string of bondage from the nation's conception. It was incubated in the slavery of Egypt. That's where the nation began for 400 years. But what we see is how quickly people are to misidentify bondage or just to forget it. And even in those days of liberation when Israel was delivered from Egypt, you remember God brought them out through Moses into the wilderness. They had cried out to God for deliverance because of the hard bondage of the Egyptians, and then God delivers them. But the first lesson they learned is that independence from Egypt required dependence upon God. And so the griping and the murmuring began almost immediately to Moses. Why did you take us out of Egypt? We had it so good there. We were eating the leeks and the onions. But they forgot the heart bondage. People are very quick to forget bondage. And of course, because of their abandonment of their dependence upon God, in the years following, they eventually went into bondage in Babylon, and then Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome, which is where they currently are at this moment. They're in bondage as a people, as they're telling Jesus, we've never been in bondage. And oftentimes, people who can't identify spiritual bondage have a very hard time understanding political bondage. They don't understand the very nature of liberty, freedom. And the only thing that can show that person their bondage is the truth of God's word. Why else do you think it is that in a nation that prides itself in this idea of relative truth? Oh, we're a nation where you can have your own truth. Truth is relative. Make your own truth. Whatever your own truth is, that's truth. That's truth for you, and it's good enough for us, unless you happen to believe in this truth. You ever notice the contradictory nature of relative truth, that it applies to everyone except the Christians when we share our truth, which comes from God's truth, and they say, no, that's not allowed. We don't allow that truth here, but they allow all others. And of course, behind that is the enemy, who knows that when this truth gets into a society, it changes people, brings people to the light. The Bible is the truth that will set us free. And here's what the Bible presents in verses 34 through 36, and that is freedom's decision. Jesus saying to them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son does remain forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed. It's very important to point out